As we continue our journey through the spiritual practices, one of those that we're going to talk about is generosity. Now, all of these practices, as a reminder, are not just ways to become better people or to learn some principles, but specifically to follow Jesus in order to become more like him. And generosity, as one of the most notable characteristics of God, is also one of the best evidences that we're beginning to think and feel and act and love like Jesus. And this, by the way, goes all the way back to Genesis with a God who created this beautifully extravagant world filled with birds and beasts and fish and humans, all of us generously provided for. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 9, encouraging us to give generously, motivates us with the reminder that we have a God who has, quote, distributed freely. He has given to the poor. He supplies seed for the sower and bread for food. This is the Father who, according to Jesus, cares even for the little birds and the flowers of the field. But then Jesus goes even further. In Matthew chapter 5, he tells us to love our enemies. But the reason that he gives is that we may be children of the Father, the one who gives sunlight to both the evil and to the good. He sends rain on the just and the unjust. He is a God who is indiscriminately generous. So biblical generosity begins with the understanding that we have a God who is the source, in the words of James, of every good and perfect gift. Psalm 24 verse 1 says it this way, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it." As a young boy, my dad encouraged my brothers and I to tithe. Now, if you've never heard that word literally just means a tenth. Give a tenth of what you have. And I remember still the first $10 bill that I received, and I'm going to be honest, I did not want to give a dollar of that. I had plans for that dollar. But something shifted in me when my dad said, "Micah, you're not giving a dollar of your money to God. God has just given you 10 of his." See, true worship and generosity starts with the recognition of what Paul said. Whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, whatever you do, time, talents, money, do it all for the glory of God. Why? Because it all belongs to him. But there are some practical questions in how do we approach giving? Put another way, how do we, as followers of Jesus, model biblical generosity? Well, if you go back to the Old Testament, most people are aware that God's people tithed. But actually, there were several tithes that they brought from their crops and livestock. They would bring to the Lord, and you can read about this in the books of Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. But the first tithe was literally called the first tithe, was for the Levites. These were the people who were responsible for the care of God's house. They cared spiritually for the people. They were teachers and trusted civil servants in society. They made sure that weights and exchanges were fair. They often witnessed agreements between different parties, so they had a lot of roles. But the first tithe went to the Levites primarily because they were not allowed to own property. God didn't want them distracted working the land so that they weren't able to do this primary work. So the tithe provided for the Levites. You can read about this in Leviticus 27 verse 30, Numbers chapter 18. But in case you're wondering, the Levites were also required to tithe from their tithe. Well, the second tithe that the Old Testament people of God gave was money set aside for feasts and holy days. This money was not given to the Levites, but used to buy food and have a feast to the Lord. Deuteronomy 12 is a good example of this second tithe. And then finally, the last tithe was every 3 years. You see, tithing took place in a 7-year cycle. The first tithe, which we've just talked about, was brought every year by the people of God. The second tithe, they brought on years 1, 2, 4, and 5. Which begs the question, what about years 3 and 6? Well, this was the third tithe, known as the poor tithe. This was money that was set aside in every town in order to provide for the needs among them, for the orphan and the widow and the foreigner. And you can read about this in several places. Deuteronomy chapter 26, verse 12 is a great example. But if you want one place to go to see these three tithes, Deuteronomy chapter 14 is a great chapter that walks through them in succession. But the point of all this, as you can see, is that 10%, which we typically think of as the tithe, was just the minimum that these people gave. And that doesn't even include free will offerings like the one that you read about in Deuteronomy chapter 16, where they would bring whatever that God had given them according to how he had blessed them. But what does that mean for us today? Well, when we reach the New Testament, a couple things to notice. First of all, it's important to recognize that there is no New Testament command to tithe. There's no percentage that's mandated. There's no amount we're told to give. But on the other hand, the priorities of the Old Testament, helping the needy, supporting those who provide spiritual care for people, those show up over and over as normative practices for the people of God. One example of this is 1 Timothy chapter 5, where Paul writes to Timothy about the importance of, first of all, caring for the widows that were among them, much like our benevolent fund at MAC is designed to do. But then the second half of the chapter, he talks about compensating those who preach and teach and oversee the church. Never as a command, but as a general practice for the New Testament church. Other examples of the New Testament include Galatians 6, verse 6, and 1 Corinthians 9, verse 14. But how did Paul practically gather these contributions? 1 Corinthians 16, we learn that he instructed not only the Corinthian church, but also the Galatian church to set aside money every week based on their income in order that it could be collected and distributed to meet the needs of the people. But again, there's never a law in the New Testament or this mandate that's put on us, but rather an invitation to participate in the generosity that God himself so beautifully demonstrates. And this is why Paul says in one place that giving should be cheerful, not under compulsion or forced or coerced, but rather a personal decision we make in response to the generosity we've received. But how do we arrive at these decisions? Friends, I'd love to tell you, here's the answer. Here's the amount. And that's often what we want, isn't it? We want the rule. But it strikes me that when Jesus gave his teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, he regularly takes an Old Testament custom or law to a deeper heart level. For example, Matthew 5, verse 21, he said, "You've heard it said, 'Do not murder,' but I say to you," and then he basically goes on to talk about how we're not only called to love our neighbor, but our enemies as ourselves. Friends, let me ask you this. What is easier for us to do? Avoid killing someone or love your enemy the way you love yourself? See, we want a box to check, but Jesus wants our hearts. And so I wonder if Jesus' teaching in Matthew 5 had included the words, "You've heard it said, give 10%, but I say to you." How would he have finished that sentence? We don't know, but Luke chapter 6, Jesus said to his disciples, "Give to anyone who asks. Lend money without expecting anything in return." That's radical, but that's Jesus' generosity. Paul said, "You know the grace of our Lord Jesus, that though he was rich, yet for our sake he became poor, that through his poverty we might become rich." Guys, biblical generosity isn't just funding a cause. It's demonstrating the gospel. It's a response to the mercy we've received, where we get past this compartmentalized, calculated approach, where we are giving God his amount, to the point where we can bring everything we are, everything we have, to be used however he pleases. And finally, the beauty of generosity and the brilliance, really, is that this isn't just some humanitarian effort where we give and give and give. Giving is how we will be blessed. Proverbs 22 verse 9 says, "A generous man will himself be blessed." Jesus said it is more blessed to give than to receive. Paul in 2 Corinthians 9 said if we want a generous harvest, which I think we would all say we do, we need to be willing to invest generously. Friends, generosity doesn't flow from surplus. That's how we often think. People give a lot because they have a lot. But it's exactly the opposite. Generosity doesn't flow from surplus. Surplus flows from generosity. When we invest in what really matters, when we bring our first and best to God, He promises to bless and to reward us abundantly. And such promises we have attached to giving, it deepens our trust in God. It guards us against worldliness. It grows our desire for the things of God. And I think this is partly why Paul, when he thanked the Philippian church for their financial support, he was clear to say, hey, it's not the gift that I'm after. It's the fruit that I know will come in your own lives when you give. Guys, generosity is one of the primary ways we follow Jesus in order to become like Jesus. But what that looks like for each one of us, our time, our talents, our treasure, that's between you and God in the context of conversation and community. So we're going to take some time now to look at a short story in the New Testament, an example of generosity, and then we'll have some questions to discuss.